Okay. Hello, everyone. I have the great misfortune of being the very last speaker at the end of 2 days of very intense brainstorming on the Early Republic. I know you're tired. I'm tired and jet lagged. So I will try my best not to keep you very long. I'll try to keep it short. I know that Zeynep Çelik-Tunçen and Ararat Şekeryan have been thanked too many times. Let me thank them one last time in the name of all the panelists for a great conference. On a personal note, let me say that I'm very happy and honored to have Ayşe Hoca as my discussant. I was very positively surprised that I'm not the only person in this room who has been inspired by that Turkish political history, Turkish political thought course. I think I took it as a special student when it was first offered by you. I was a graduate student at Middle East Technical University and terribly bored with what I was doing. So your class was recommended. I took it and it set me on a different course. So I owe a lot to your inspiration. Now, in my talk, I am going to talk about the Center-Periphery thesis, the rise and fall of this thesis, its impact on Turkish studies during the past 50 years almost. This is the 50th anniversary, actually, exactly. I'll try to question whether the Center-Periphery thesis, the dominant explanatory model in the field of Turkish studies for at least the past 30 years or so, whether it does the job, whether it delivers what it promises. After what is, I'm afraid, going to be a very long introduction on the origins and context and instrumentality of the Center-Periphery thesis, I will try to respond to questions like, to what extent can we rely on the Center-Periphery thesis to frame opposition in the early republic? Is it a good framework to understand and analyze the relationship between opposition and the political center? What are its shortcomings? And how did the Center-Periphery thesis skew research and even distort our understanding of the early republic? Let me start by introducing what I'm talking about. Everybody associates Center-Periphery thesis with Sherif Mardin's 1973 Dedalus article called Center-Periphery Relations, a Key to Turkish Politics. This is the best known article, but it's not the only one. From the mid-1960s to the early 1970s, he wrote 2 more articles along the same lines. One appeared in Comparative Studies in Society and History in 1969. This article is called Power, Civil Society and Culture in the Ottoman Empire. The other one in 1971 in International Journal of Middle East Studies, Ideology and Religion in the Turkish Revolution. And he also published a book chapter in 1974, a long title, you would remember the term super-Westernization. The 1973 article, however, it's the best known article that is associated with this. And also, it happens to be the most cited article in the entire field of Turkish studies. The last time I checked it on Google Scholar, it had received more than 1,300 citations. By far, it beats everyone else. Now, in this corpus of articles and chapters, Sherif Mardin pretty much makes the same arguments again and again. First, that Ottoman Turkish history must be understood within the framework of a strong center versus a weak periphery, and that the civil society was either weak or it was absent. 2, the Ottoman center fortified itself politically, economically, and culturally vis-a-vis the periphery for centuries, right? So the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman center emerged as the dominant actor by suppressing these other institutions and groups which had the potential for opposition against the center. All these actors and institutions of opposition were quashed. 3, Mardin says that this so-called strong state tradition was inherited and replicated by the Republic. And finally, he suggests that we must take ideology, religion, culture, state, and state elites very, very seriously. So his work definitely falls into a Weberian system of thinking. Now, what are the origins of the Center-Periphery thesis? How and why did Sherif Mardin come up with this idea or argument? How did he invent it? What's the context? Now, this takes me to late 1960s. This is the period of the rise of the Turkish far left. Today, we kind of regard them as living fossils, but they were extremely powerful then. This is the time when Che Guevara was winning hearts and minds of the Turkish youth. This is the period of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the 68 student revolutions in Ankara and Istanbul and elsewhere, and Sherif Mardin's home base in Ankara, right? Siyasal Bilgiler Fakültesi of Ankara University, the renowned Turkish Grande École, Mülkiye Mektebi. It had become probably the center of student activism, the hotbed of Turkish far leftists. Boycotts, sit-in protests, right? The campus was wrecked by student activism. Now, Sherif Mardin, being a political liberal all along, he was feeling increasingly marginalized in this atmosphere. He was feeling marginalized because of students who would speak up against them in the classrooms, and also by many faculty members who now did not treat him apparently very nicely. Therefore, he applies for a sabbatical leave. This is either in 69 or in 1970. I couldn't figure out, maybe you can see why. Because where does he go to for his sabbatical? Columbia University, right? He shows up here. Apparently, he was good friends with Dankert Rostov, a very important comparative politics scholar at the time and a specialist in Turkey. Now, Sherif Mardin had a lifelong tendency to cozy up with graduate students because he would learn what's the latest academic fads from them. So he met with the Turkish graduate students here. One of them was a very young Sabri Sayarı, and this is what I learned from Sabri Hoca. I interviewed him. So he says, well, Sabri, what are you reading these days? And Sabri Sayarı says, well, there's this guy from University of Chicago called Edward Shills, and we read his articles. He takes a look at these articles, and the rest is history. So Center-Periphery thesis, or at least its Turkish version, was born on Columbia University ground. So a full circle. I would like to underline, and this is extremely important, Mardin adapted Shill's theory to respond to left-wing interpretations of Turkish politics. This is something very much forgotten today. His main target was the left-wing interpreters of Turkish society and Turkish politics, people such as Doğan Avcıoğlu, Mustafa Akdağ, Hikmet Kıvılcımlı, and Mihri Belli. The left-wing interpreters were trying to recreate, to reinvent Turkish history on the basis of a struggle between base and superstructure, downplaying the superstructure, whereas Mardin, he was underlining again, the so-called superstructure. He was saying that this is a lot more important than everything else. He was attempting to turn the spotlight on state, religion, ideology, culture, and elites. That's why I said he's very Weberian. Now, in the 1970s and early 1980s, Mardin was not read very much outside of two campuses in Turkey. Those happen to be the Anglophone campuses, Boğaziçi and Middle East Technical University. Elsewhere, because the left-wing domination of the academia, at least in social sciences, it continued, he was shunned, right? People did not take him seriously, did not put his works on the syllabi. And he had a brief stint at Boğaziçi University, establishing a department there. But then eventually he left Turkey for the United States. He taught at American University, I think at least for 10 years, maybe even more. Then things happened in Turkey in the 1980s. There's the coup d'etat, the post-coup period. The far left is declining and it's terribly disillusioned. And new political actors are on the rise. Which new political actors? The liberal left, the Islamists, and Kurds. Mardin, in this environment, and in the United States, he wrote his very influential book on Said Nursi, reclaiming him as a very important figure of the early Republican period. The book appeared in 1989, and he was immediately discovered by the new actors, right? The liberal left, Kurds, and Islamists. The liberal left publishing house, İletişim, they began to publish Sherif Mardin's collected works. His translators are very interesting, but maybe we don't have time for that. So what I'm trying to say is we have new wine in an old bottle, right? This is the second life of Sherif Mardin's Center-Periphery thesis, the one that we are much more familiar with. Mardin's Center-Periphery thesis in its original form, it's ripped from that, and it is put into a new use. The new actor's main narrative was to posit a historically strong state versus a weak periphery, which in this case, the strong state does not allow opposition. The strong state, of course, is taken to mean as the military bureaucracy, the civilian bureaucracy, and the justice bureaucracy, the state elites. Metin Heper is going to reframe this as the strong state tradition. Well, by the early 1990s, Mardin is very hot in Turkish academia. His Center-Periphery thesis is now employed to explain a new political cleavage. I cannot describe how dominant this was in the 1990s and early 2000s. I lived through this as a graduate student. Together with the term vesayet, tutelage, Center-Periphery was the buzzword of Turkish social sciences during this period. It was used as an explanation for a number of things. First, Center-Periphery was used to describe why Turkish civil society is weak or has been weak. Secondly, for why Turkey has not democratized and is not able to democratize. And third, it provided a very easy recipe for democratization in the future. The so-called actors of the periphery, who are they? The pious Muslim masses and the Kurds, they must move to the political center, occupy it, and then transform and democratize Turkey from within. Now, a very important question to ask at this point is, why didn't Mardin object to the new interpretation of this theory? Why did he seem to agree? I don't know. Is this because he was liberal? Maybe. Is this because he enjoyed newly found fame? Possible. But he did distinguish himself from the rest of the liberal leftists in 2007 when he began to lecture about mahalle baskısı, neighborhood pressure. And many of his liberal leftist friends were kind of cross with him because he raised doubts about the possibility of democratization through these new actors. The early republic is reinterpreted by the Center-Periphery thesis and its proponents. The early republic, or rather the long early republic, this is the period from 1908 to 1950. Maybe I should problematize the term a little bit, right? Nobody until 1980s called the early republic the early republic. The term was invented in the middle of the 1980s. Everyone else before referred to this period either as period of Atatürk and İnönü, single party period. Early political scientists called it the First Republic. But early republic as a period, it appears in the middle of the 1980s. So it's very much intertwined with the rise of the Center-Periphery thesis. I think it would be a very curious thing I'm very curious about the origins of this. Now, how was this period interpreted by the proponents of the theory? First of all, there was a very common tendency to collapse the Unionists and Kemalists into a single group of elites, right? Since Erik Jan Zürcher, this had become very common, the argument that Turkey was run by a single group of elites from the 1908 until 1950s. Secondly, together, this group, the new elite, they controlled a powerful state, the so-called strong state. All these texts have common keywords. So Jacobin, top-down, tepeden inme, tutelage, vesayet, elitist or seçkinci, it's all over these texts. The narrative is such that this strong state suppressed non-Muslim minority groups, as well as Muslim minority groups, Kurds and pious Muslims, as well as gender, suppression of gender identities. It invented, the early republic, according to this view, invented a secular nationalist ideology, identity even, and forced it on all Muslim citizens. Right? These Muslim citizens were forced into a straitjacket and expected to conform. Muslim minority groups, Kurds, for example, they were seen as potential Turks who could eventually transform. And certainly the narrative, not the narrative, but the early republic excluded the non-Muslims. They were not even potential. Again, the story goes, the strong state crushes Turkish opposition, and Turkish democracy is flawed because of mistaken policies which date back to this period of original sin, 1908 to 1950. This narrative was largely adopted by the liberal left, Kurdish and Islamist scholars in Turkey and also abroad, right? Very common in English, French, and German. It was dominant, I would say, until 2013, until Gezi, when there was overnight a shift in the tone of the scholarship. Currently, the hold of the theory over social sciences in Turkey is largely declining. Now, as I said at the beginning, the Center-Periphery thesis is currently 50 years old. So I think it's time to provide a balance sheet to look at the credit side and the debit side, what's good and what's bad. On the credit side, the theory, I think, did a great job of providing an alternative to Kemalist official narratives, as well as the leftist narratives, right? That were dominant before it. So it enriched the debate. And secondly, they did a good job of deconstructing the Kemalist official narrative and exposing systematic inequality, policies of assimilation and exclusion, even acts of racism during this period. On the debit side, first of all, the theory confined root causes of authoritarianism to the long early republic, right? The period between 1908 and 1950, and by doing so, it whitewashed authoritarian actors, institutions, and tendencies before and after, right? It was very common for many years in Turkey to, for example, study the Democrats as agents of democratization, as things suddenly changed overnight in 1950. Adnan Menderes, despite all of his very authoritarian tendency, because of what happened to him at the end, right, his tragic end, he was celebrated as the patron saint of Turkish democracy. So very common, this tendency. Secondly, the Center-Periphery thesis invented the strong state as a straw man and beat it for all of Turkey's current problems. Civil military relations or the domination of the military, it's the center. State and religion, it's the center. Alevis, Kurds, right, ethnic questions, everything is blamed on this strong state. Finally, it portrayed the periphery as inherently weak, yet composed of potentially democratizing actors. They are the majority, according to this theory, and if they can collaborate, something which did not happen before, but it is going to happen after 1990s, if they can collaborate, they can dominate the ballot box, push the military back into the barracks, and do the same to the bureaucracy as well, and they can bring democracy to Turkey. Now, after this crude summary of the contents of the theory, the critics emerged very early on. Right? We find first the Turkish leftists who were very critical of the theory. Well, of course, they knew what No, this is only for me. Yes, yeah. Don't worry. The Turkish left was quite aware that the theory originally targeted them. So there's a long line of scholars, starting with Sungur Savran, Galip Yalman, and a host of others. If you want to check two special issues of Toplum ve Bilim, numbers 105 and 127, it's full of criticism, left-wing criticism of the theory. They argued that the theory is not just wrong, it is also an extension of neoliberalism and neoliberal domination in Turkey. And since 2010, we see the emergence of new work on the CHP, Republican People's Party, and Kemalism. Just to name a few words, a few scholars, Rıfat Bali, Yüksel Taşkın, Metin, well, I forgot his name, the guy who wrote a very interesting book about the conservative faction in Republican People's Party during the early Republican period. So very critical works began to emerge, and since 2015 there is this big debate going on which centers on the concept of post-Kemalism. Now, what are the shortcomings of the Center-Periphery thesis in terms of framing the opposition in Turkey during the early Republican period? Now, one question I think to raise at this point is to ask, was the center really so dominant? Was the state so strong? Did the state truly dominate and penetrate the periphery during the early Republican period? Nazım İrem, Metin Çınar, and İlbey Özdemirci, and I'm going to say more about them soon, they argue that the center, the so-called political center, is not monolithic, had not been monolithic. It was rife with factionalism, and this factionalism is usually swept under the carpet. Two, my colleague Berk Esen is usually known for his work on competitive authoritarianism, but I think we should give him more credit about his very first academic publication in 2011, an article that appeared in Turkish Studies, in which he compares the CHP during the early Republican period with other cases of single party and dominant party regimes in what he calls nationalist developmentalist regimes. So this is countries like Israel, Egypt, Argentina, India, and Japan. And he concludes that compared to these other cases of single or dominant parties, Republican People's Party was weak. And how does he measure that? He says that the first time Republican People's Party enters a free and fair election, it fails. That's not the case, for example, with the PRI in Mexico, Congress Party in India, MAPAI in Israel, or the NDP in Egypt. So the Republican People's Party was not able to tame opposition, could not strike a bargain with key opposition actors, and lost power as a result. I would argue that the Kemalists exaggerated their power in order to brag about the changes they brought to Turkey. Right? They wanted to say that, hey, we achieved so much. On the other hand, I think the liberal left, Kurds, and Islamists, they exaggerated, in turn, state power in order to be able to say how much they suffered from it. Oh, 3 minutes? Okay. So I would say that these two groups happen to be the two sides of the same coin in terms of ascribing so much importance to state power. The center was not able to control the periphery. It's not because of lack of will. I'm sure they desperately wanted to control everything, but they lacked infrastructure, they lacked logistics, they lacked technology and budget. This has huge implications. In 1923, Turkey's urban... Okay, that should be added to my 3 minutes. In 1923, Turkey's urban population was about 18%, and 82% was rural. In 1950, at the end of the early Republican period, the urban population rose to slightly over 30%. So what this means is that the vast majority of the Turkish population located in the rural periphery was beyond the reach of the center. This is corroborated by field research done in those years. We have a series of works, anthropological studies and sociological studies on villages. Niyazi Berk Esen, 1942, Behice Boran, 1945, Ibrahim Yasa, 1955, and Paul Sterling's seminal work, nobody reads it today for some reason, The Turkish Village, that it has a final chapter called The Village and the World. He describes in amazing prose the huge gap that separates the Turkish village from the urban areas. And he did field research in 1948 in two Kayseri villages. So the implications of this rural-urban divide for the opposition is, where is the opposition located? Is it located in the urban areas? That means they could easily be hunted by the center. So if you happen to be a leftist in the period from 1923 to 1950, the state can monitor you and punish you very easily. Remember what happened to TKP, Turkish Communist Party members, either going underground or being imprisoned or leaving the country. This is true for the non-Muslim minority groups who happen to be urban and bore the brunt of exclusionary policies during this period. But let's compare that with cases of rural or small town opposition, Kurds, Naqshbandis, and other groups of religious opposition in the periphery. It's a totally different story. In their case, policies of assimilation were weak, they were poorly planned, poorly funded, and therefore achieved little. A huge exception, of course, here is the massacre in Darcy in 1937. As opposed to what they wanted to achieve, the center or the planners in the center, their policies mostly backfired in the rural areas. They antagonized more people than they were supposed to win over. Was the opposition so weak as it is described in the literature? Well, references has been made to Murat Metinsoy's book. His terms flexible secularism, flexible authoritarianism is largely about this, how the center was not as authoritarian as it is described and how people found ways to circumvent it, right? Alluding to James Scott's Weapons of the Weak. Likewise, İlbey Özdemirci's recent work, The Sheikh with the Top Hat, which appeared in Turkish very recently, he blurs the line that separates the pious from the secular. He interviewed the remnants of very few surviving members of the ulema from the early Republican periods. He presents excellent information. Okay? So what I'm trying to say, I have only reached the conclusion right now. First of all, the center-periphery theory reduces the Turkish state and party to being monolithic and unitary actors, and it did not acknowledge the existence of different views and policies within the state and party. This factionalism has to be acknowledged at this point. We should even start to talk about Kemalisms instead of a singular Kemalism. Second, the center-periphery theory does not distinguish between time blocks. 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, all the same. Atatürk versus İnönü, all the same. 5 years of transition to democracy, 45 to 1950, the same as the period before. The CPT, center-periphery theory, does not distinguish between opposition actors, urban versus rural, ethnic versus religious, versus leftists, versus gender groups, pious people versus tarikats versus Islamists. Let me finally say, because I have no time, I think we should get rid of this overemphasis on ideology, a singular Kemalism dictating policy, and not taking into consideration other factors. First of all, was there a singular Kemalism? We need to ask this question. Secondly, how do we disentangle the factor of ideology from other possible factors in determining policy making in early Republican Turkey? How do we measure that? Ideology versus other factors. So we should challenge this supremacy ascribed to Kemalism in understanding and analyzing the early republic. Thank you.